So a couple things about today's session. Today's session is being recorded. If you're in attendance today, you're going to get a copy of the recording. If you are in attendance today, you will also receive your certificate of completion that will come through onto your dashboard if you have a Supply Chain School account. If you don't have an account, would strongly recommend that you create one so that you get credit for attending today, as well as a wealth of other resources that school has to offer. Cameras and mics will be off today. But if you do have any questions, we strongly recommend that you drop them in the chat. Even if you want to just say hi, say where you're joining from, we'd love to hear from you. But we will make sure that we answer questions throughout, so don't be shy. If you do have any issues with the chat function, you can drop me an email and I'll be sure to help you out. I believe that's everything that I needed to say. So I'm going to hand it over to Anna, who is a lead consultant with Action Sustainability and resident expert on all things modern slavery, human rights, and forced labor. Thrilled to have you with us today, Anna. And I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you. And nice to have you all on the webinar with me today. So yeah, as Wendy said, I'm Anna Cantwell. I'm a lead consultant to Action Sustainability in the Supply Chain School. And my background is very much sustainable procurement, modern slavery and human rights. So very much looking where those human issues sit within the supply chain. Wendy's already gone through the housekeeping, so things will be shared at the end. You're on mute, your cameras are off, so get yourselves nice and comfy. Please use the Q&A feature or the chat function, ask away, and I'll try my best to answer any questions that you put through in the chat throughout. Just a bit about us. So the school is delivered by Action Sustainability, and what we do is we work with organisations through lots of different training. We do assessments, we do consultancy work, and we do monitoring and measuring of sustainability performance, with lots of different clients, especially in the built environment. So the school is part of what we do, and we see that sort of capability and awareness building as a crucial part to dealing with sustainability in the built environment. So to get started today, what I wanted to do was really just sort of start with the basics of, what modern slavery is. So modern slavery, especially in the United States context. So as you can probably tell, my accent isn't from that part of the world. So today I am giving that spin of United States, so ignore the accent. But in the US, modern slavery is very much seen as the exploitation of a person for labour, services or commercial sex through fraud, coercion or force. So it's very much a force piece. It's where the person cannot freely leave. So it's very closely aligned with what is called in US law, is called human trafficking. So to qualify as modern slavery under US law, at least one of these are typically present. So that's where someone is forced, either by physical restraint, violence or threats, by fraud, which is deception about work, pay or conditions, coercion, which could be psychological pressure, it could be debt, it could be threats of deportation or harm. And the main forms of modern slavery in the United States is forced labour, which is commonly found in agriculture, construction, domestic work and hospitality. It's where workers may have passports confiscated or be trapped in debt situations. Another one is sex trafficking. So any commercial sex involving force, fraud or coercion is considered as modern slavery. It might be debt bondage, so which is where people are forced to work to repay loans they can never realistically clear. Or it could be domestic servitude. So this is often individuals, often migrant workers who are being exploited in private homes. So that's the definition, but what does it look like across the world? So the scale of modern slavery is rather large. It's a huge widespread issue. So about 50 million people are estimated at the moment to be living in modern slavery across the world. So this is actually an increase as well of a report published by the Global Slavery Index over the last few years, an increase in 10 million since the last report was published. So that makes roughly 1 in every 150 people globally is affected by modern slavery conditions. So as a breakdown, what we see in that 50 million is 28 million of those are in forced labour, 22 million are in forced marriage, and there are 12 million children who are affected by this across the world. So it's an increasingly global issue. So there's been a rise in 20% since 2018. And what is that rise due to? So we're seeing that rise. Potentially it could be better transparency. People are building their knowledge on this topic. There's more awareness, or it's very likely linked to what's going on in the world right now. We've got conflict, we've got displacement, we've got economic inequality and poverty. We had COVID, which created lots and lots of vulnerable people, and we have weak labour protections across the world. So the Global Slavery Index is a really good resource to look at when you're wanting facts and figures of what's going on in the world in this space. It publishes the index, which comes up with the different prevalence numbers. So the highest prevalence rate, which is the rate per population in this index, are appearing in North Korea, Eritrea, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So that's the highest prevalence. So that's looking at it per population. But the total highest numbers are actually in India, China, Pakistan, North Korea, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Regionally, when you look at the different regions, the Asia Pacific has the largest number of victims. I'm just going to have a look in the chat there to see if there's any questions. No, we're all good. So what I was hoping to do here is play a bit of a video, which is from the ILO about child labour. So a big focus on child labour here. In 2015, the world made a promise to end child labour by 2025. So that was last year. That timeline has obviously now come to an end, but child labour has not. So today, nearly 138 million children remain in child labour worldwide. So while the elimination of child labour remains an unfinished task, the latest global estimates bring some good news. So it's always nice to get good news in this space, which is often quite few and far between. So after concerning rise in child labour captured by the global estimates for 2020, a feared further deterioration in the wake of COVID, it didn't materialise, and the world has succeeded in returning to a path of progress. So we're now on the right path. So then are now over 100 million fewer children in child labour today than in 2000, in the world 2000. So even as the child population has increased by 230 million over that same time period, we're seeing less children in child labour conditions. So when we share the slides to this, I'll share this video because it is a really good video just sort of showing how that's happened and the journey that we've come on to get there. Among all the children in child labour, 2 in 5, so 54 million, perform hazardous work. So of these 54 million children, close to half are under the age of 15, and nearly 1 in 5 is younger than age 12. So while children of all ages must be protected from hazardous work, its persistence among younger children is really, really worrying. Their physical and psychological immaturity amplifies the risks that hazardous work may result in serious injury or illness, with potentially lifelong consequences. So beyond the human toll, there's also significant economic costs on societies arisen through the loss of human capabilities and increased healthcare that's needed. So, child labour is not just an issue to the children, it's also a hazard to the global economy. Hazardous child labour exists in lots of different sectors, and it poses the greatest concern in industry where more than 60% of all child labour is hazardous. So what we're looking at in there is in services such as hazardous work accounts for nearly half of all child labour. Where we're looking at that, it's very much in the agricultural sector. So in agriculture, around 1 in a third of this child labour is hazardous. So these differences reflect both the nature of the task performed and the range of environments in which children work. So from handling dangerous machinery in factories, to carrying heavy loads in markets, to exposure to agrochemicals in fields. So if you're looking at the different sectors, if you combine agriculture with construction, which feeds directly into the construction industry, making building materials, so it's very prevalent in the built environment. Moving on from child labour, if we take a deeper look at what modern slavery looks like in the US, so the United States is the wealthiest nation in the Americas, and it has the strongest response globally behind the UK, according to the Global Slavery Index, against modern slavery. So it has a strong response to modern slavery in its legislation, and it reflects robust measures to identify and support survivors. However, there are several gaps in the response that they're in place in the legislation. But if we look at the numbers, so the 2023 Global Slavery Index estimates that on any given day, there were 1.1 million people living in modern slavery in the US, which is a prevalence of 3.3 people in modern slavery for every 1,000 people in the country, which is quite a large prevalence. This places the US among countries with the prevalence around 21 out of 25 and globally 122 out of 160 countries. But it represents the highest estimated total number of people in modern slavery in the Americas, accounting for over 1/5 of people in modern slavery across the region. So the data on this is aggregated at a national level, making the true number of cases reported quite difficult to ascertain. So it's very much an estimate on here. And what we often recommend with estimates is you can anticipate that the estimates are probably actually higher than what is brought about by the different sources of information they're getting these figures from. In addition to having them on homegrown soil, we also noting that the products that we buy connects us to modern slavery. So although the highest prevalence of forced labour is found in lower income countries, it's deeply connected in that demand from higher income countries like the US. So nearly 2/3 of all forced labour cases are linked to global supply chains, with workers exploited across a wide range of sectors and at every stage of the supply chain. Most forced labour occurs in the lowest tiers of supply chains, that is in the extraction of raw materials and in production stages. The sheer volume of imports into the G20 demonstrates the power these countries have to influence market standards and combat forced labour. So currently G20 countries are importing more than over $468 billion worth of products at risk of being produced with forced labour. The US is not only affected by modern slavery within its borders, and it's one of the world's largest economies, and it's exposed to the risk of modern slavery through the products that it's importing. Nearly 2/3 of all forced labour cases are linked with the supply chain. And we can see here in the US, the different breakdown of those at-risk products. So when you're looking at different products that you're importing that are at risk of modern slavery, you're looking at electronics, you're looking at garments, textiles, timber, and fish. So they're some of the largest imports that you're buying at risk of modern slavery. Construction is also one of the largest global sectors at the highest risk of embedded modern slavery as well. So it's estimated that 13.7 trillion of construction related spend globally is linked to modern slavery. Having another look at that US context when it comes to modern slavery, prison labour is not included in that 1.1 million that we shared from the Global Slavery Index in the estimates of survivors in the US. So this is something unique that happens in the US. So in the US, you've got the highest incarceration rate of any democracy on the planet. It holds 1.2 million people in prison, which is more than 20% of the world's incarcerated population. All 50 states individually incarcerate more people per capita than most countries. 49 of these states require prisoners to produce goods and manufacture products as well. So on average, workers are making between 13 and 52 cents per hour. On top of these low wages, up to 80% is taken by the government in fees as well. So if you're looking at sort of what forced labour looks like, it is very much looking like that. Over 70% of incarcerated individuals in state prisons are required to work or face retaliation, such as solitary confinement, denied family contact, and even parole. So when you look at that definition of modern slavery, you know, that force, that coercion piece is very much linked with how people are being exploited in these situations. The more people you've got locked up in these prisons, the more money they are likely to make. So the US was the first country in the world to privatise prisons. And private prisons are owned and run by for-profit businesses, unlike publicly run prisons that are funded by tax dollars. Today, 8% of confined people are held in private prisons, and private companies annually profit $5.8 billion from this. We're also starting to see the use of private prisons in immigration detention as well. So thousands of immigrants have been subjected to forced labour while in detention, working for $1 per day and violating the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And the majority have not been convicted of a crime. So that 30,000 number is increasing. So this is an ongoing research project as well, that Design for Freedom, and we'll share the links to Design for Freedom throughout because we'll reference this quite heavily during the webinar, are publishing a white paper on. So we'll share that link once that has been published. So they're currently working on it. And what that research project will do is look at what kinds of goods are being produced in these prisons and the products that are ended up in construction, in the construction sector. So that's just a look at sort of the context of modern slavery, what it looks like across the world, and what it looks like in the US. When it comes to why you're probably here, taking an interest in this, legislation is a huge driver for why organisations are starting to take a closer look at these issues within their organisations and supply chains. So we've got a lot of global laws across the world which are forbidding the use of slave labour in the built environment. Yet we're seeing buildings and materials that go into them are heavily reliant on forced and child labour. So if we look at this global map here, you can see a bit of a breakthrough of where we've got legislation that is either very explicitly based on human rights or modern slavery, or it's linking into taking a closer look at your supply chains and where things are coming from and due diligence that should take place there. So this is growing and growing over the years, and you can see a closer look here, a breakdown on what that legislation looks like. So we've sort of broke it down by the types of law and different requirements of that law. So you can see a bit of a coverage here on what those legislations look like. So in the US, legislation that has come into play in particular is the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act. So this took effect in June 2022, and it prohibits the importation of goods made with labour from the Uyghur region in China, which is known to have state-sponsored prison detentions and genocide in that area, detaining the Uyghur population in that region. So what we've seen so far because of that piece of legislation is $3.7 billion worth of goods held up at borders because it is suspected to be made with forced labour because of origination in that region in China. So the majority of products that have been impacted by this are electronics, of which solar panels and polysilicon are a huge component which comes from that region in particular. If you think about that, that really impacts built environment projects. So you can think about how, if something's getting held up at the border because of this issue, that impacts your budget, it impacts your schedules, and it directly impacts construction sites as well. Just published this week is the USTR, how they're using that trade law to investigate other countries. So what they're doing here is they're investigating different countries on how they are failing to prevent or ban goods made with forced labour. And they used it to gain an unfair trade advantage by allowing exploitation. So they launched this investigation to 60 countries, targeting countries such as allies such as the UK, EU, Canada and Australia, and key economies such as China, India and Saudi Arabia as well. So what this investigation that they're running is doing is focusing on whether governments are adequately banning imports linked to forced labour and that they're enforcing labour standards in their supply chains. So what we're seeing is these investigations can lead to tariffs and trade sanctions, pressure on countries to tighten their labour laws, and negotiations on labour standards and trade agreements. In response to this, it might be interesting to hear, in the UK, we're actually welcoming this investigation because hopefully it will trigger more stringent due diligence laws in our own country because of this investigation that's taken place. We mentioned a huge focus on this investigation is around solar panels, which is a product under key scrutiny from the forced labour import bans. And this is because a primary raw material used to produce solar panels is polysilicon, which is found extensively in the Uyghur region in China. So between 35 and 45% of the global supply of solar-grade polysilicon comes from the Xinjiang region, which is that Uyghur region in China. Companies are taking on significant risk importing those goods, which are likely, very, very likely to be tainted with forced labour. So the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act creates a reputable presumption that goods produced in whole or in part in the Xinjiang Uyghur region of China are produced with forced labour and are prohibited from importation in the US. So as we move ahead to face the challenges created by climate crisis, we're looking at ethical decarbonisation, and we're prioritising the use of solar panels, but we're starting to see sort of that resistance in being able to get these products into the country. So in response to that, we have a couple of resources here that hopefully might be helpful if solar panels is something that you're wanting to figure out, where can we sort of do additional due diligence, figure out how we can buy these in a more responsible way. So Action Sustainability, we published a guidance document on a responsible procurement of solar panels a couple of years ago. So we can share the link to that in the follow-up as well. And we also have the Design for Freedom toolkit, which provides insights on the issues and also some guidance and a toolkit on how you can purchase more responsibly. We'll use that toolkit as a framework to deep dive into some of the high-risk materials throughout this webinar as we go on. So in addition to legislation, you've also got standards that are coming into play. So a bit of a heads up here and an FYI. An international standard on modern slavery will be launching sort of June, July this year. So ISO 37200 will provide organisations with a framework for managing the risks associated with human trafficking and forced labour, including prevention, identification and mitigation strategies. So in the UK, there's already a British standard which does this. And we've seen lots of organisations use it to develop their due diligence processes for human rights risks. So what this new standard will be is a similar standard. So if you're aware of the ISO standard 2400, which is for sustainable procurement, it's a guidance standard, so you can't be accredited to it like 9001 or 14001, but you can use this standard to gauge your maturity against best practice in this space, which is something that we do a lot with clients. So yeah, keep your eye out for this guidance standard as it's published later this year. So we're here on this webinar to take a look at high-risk materials. So what makes a high-risk material when it comes to modern slavery? We have different indicators that are in place. So if you see a multitude of these different risk indicators, it's very likely that modern slavery is involved within that organisation or its supply chains. Where you've got a number of them intersecting, that makes that likelihood even higher. So if you've got things like you're looking at the people that are in that organisation or supply chain, if you've got low skilled or low pay work, if you've got the use of temporary or transient workers, vulnerable people, migrant labour, contract and agency workers, then it's very likely there might be some exploitation taking place there. Combine that with it taking place in an industry or a country where the prevalence of modern slavery is high, so there's sort of low governance, low or weak labour laws, then that increases that level of risk even higher. In addition to that, if you've got skill shortages, material shortages, supply chain disruptions, you've got complex supply chains, you have multiple layers in the supply chains, you've got tight turnarounds, you've got high demands, that again is increasing that likelihood that exploitation is going to be taking place. So these are some of the key risk indicators you'll see which contribute to something being a high risk material or product. So on the screen here, we've got a list of 13 different materials. And it's very hard to picture ever building anything without any of these products. It's very unlikely that a building or some infrastructure project is completed without using any of these materials or products. And these are some of the highest risk construction materials and products with embedded forced labour. So it just shows how pervasive this issue is and that it's touching every major component in a building. And that's why transparency and traceability is really critical to addressing this issue. So on this list here are some of the key high-risk products that are involved and included in the Design for Freedom Toolkit. So I'm going to do now is talk through a profile for each of these products. So bricks. The brick industry is particularly vulnerable to issues of forced labour and child labour, with significant concerns at the kiln sites, especially in countries like Afghanistan, India and Nepal. Many workers at these kiln sites, including children born into debt-bonded families, face really harsh conditions. So what happens there is officials routinely overlook the forced and child labour at brick kilns, as such practices often have their roots in illicit business relationships and facilitation payments. In these regions where the kilns are, there are high levels of poverty, which is a key driving factor underpinning the forced labour systems prevalent in that industry, forcing entire families to work to pay back loans taken out to pay recruitment fees or assumed generational debt. This is then combined with exploitative practices such as withholding wages, and the brick industry in some countries can depend on keeping workers in a state of poverty to then fuel that labour pool. Nepal is a prime example, but it has also made strides as well in addressing traditional forced labour practices, and it's actively working towards eradicating forced and child labour. They have an alliance initiative called the Better Brick Nepal by Goodweave, and they're really using that to eradicate forced labour and modern slavery from their brick supply chains. So that's a standard and a certification that you can look out for. Throughout all of these profiles, where possible, we will point you towards a different certification that can help make that due diligence process when you're buying these products a little bit easier. What we're seeing in the brick space as well is very much that interconnection. And again, this is something that will come up throughout this webinar, that interconnection between climate change and modern slavery. So in countries vulnerable to climate change, changing weather patterns and extreme weather events, especially heavy rainfall, can disrupt the work at kilns, which then indebts workers further while they're unable to produce bricks. On the flip side of it, because of climate change, we're seeing areas which used to have really high agricultural work, and because of the climate, they can no longer do that work. So then they're put in a desperate situation and they're being forced to work in the brick kilns. So you can see how the climate is disrupting that work and keeping them in that cycle, or disrupting their original work in agriculture and forcing them to be put into the cycle. Concrete is the next one. So concrete is by far the most widely used construction material in the world. More than 70% of the world's population lives in a building containing concrete. It's made up of several materials, including cement, sand, gravel, and crushed stone. And these materials often come from countries where material extraction is not regulated, and worker safety and fair labour laws are not enforced. Concrete produces 8% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions as well, making it the largest contributor of embodied carbon. And it's also at high risk of forced labour, which occurs very much during the quarrying of limestone and gravel and the mining of mica and soda ash. So another component is sand, and the illegal trade of sand, which is a key component, is valued at the third highest illegal trade globally, with revenues ranging from approximately 200 billion to 349 billion. The concrete industry produces 4 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide, and concrete produces as much carbon dioxide emissions as all the cars in the world combined. So when we're looking at a solution to some of these issues, a good certificate which does look at the labour involved in the supply chain and also the carbon element of concrete is the Concrete Sustainability Council certification. So again, something to consider in that due diligence process. Glass is another material. So it's a composite material, and it comprised of raw materials that are at high risk of forced labour. which again occurs during that mining and extraction stage. Currently, there's no industry standards that include third-party audited labour input specific to glass. So glass is obviously integral to the construction. It's used for facades, cladding, insulation, and it's made by melting raw materials such as sand, soda ash and limestone. Knowing how something is made, what it's made up of, and the composition of something is really, really important when you're mapping out the due diligence that you're going to do, or where you're assessing the likelihood of modern slavery taking place. And again, just knowing what's in a material or in a product or where it's coming from can help guide the questions that you're starting to ask of your suppliers. So these materials used in that composition of glass are at high risk of forced labour. They're coming from low and middle income economies, and it involves sand, gravel, crushed stone, and the mining for that is frequently undertaken by artisanal miners who rely on this type of activity for their livelihoods. The informal nature of these mines means they're unregulated and they're not enforced, which increases that risk. Next one we have is metals. So the mining of metals such as copper, cobalt, iron ore and bauxite have been linked to forced labour abuses, particularly in countries where the mining sector has come under the control of organised criminal organisations or the military. In some countries, high rates of migrant and contracted workers at mine sites increases that forced labour risk. There's widespread reports of children and adults being made to work in hazardous and unhealthy conditions for long periods of time. A significant proportion of the world's metals are extracted from artisanal mines, which we just mentioned before, which then increases that likelihood of forced labour. Interestingly as well, more than 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, where large and small-scale mining operations are often reliant on forced labour. So if you can take a look at the pie chart on the screen there, you'll see that reliance, where it's coming from. It's very much coming from the DRC. So materials such as cobalt and copper are really, really under public scrutiny at the moment for that forced labour and child labour, because they're producing key elements in renewable batteries, solar panels, roofing systems, pipes and cladding. So again, knowing what the raw materials are in these products that you're buying is really important, because then you can hopefully figure out where it is that it's coming from, starting to ask those right questions of your supply chain. And you can see again how very much it's interlinked. You know, going down that green economy route, you still need to be doing due diligence. Whilst there will be benefits for the environment, there could be a human cost in the same vein as that. Next one we have here are minerals. So minerals such as mica, silica and gypsum are raw materials used in the built environment. And they often originate from countries with documented cases of forced labour, child labour, corruption and poverty. So there's a lack of safety enforcement, which very much leads to accidents during the extraction and transportation of this. Some of the top producing countries have poverty driving child exploitation, and it's resulted in lethal incidents in unregulated mines. Top producers of the minerals have been linked to forced labour, and mining companies have been associated with state-sponsored work programmes, which transfer workers to locations with mineral deposits. And workers in these programmes cannot refuse employment assignments, nor can they freely exit jobs. It's very much linked again with corruption. So we often see, if you were to compare the corruption index against the global slavery index, they very much intertwine. High levels of corruption creates vulnerability in the population, which then increases that likelihood of modern slavery. So corruption can encourage local officials to allow companies to operate without regard for environmental impacts. So as well as the human cost of this, the mining of these minerals is very much impacting the environment as well. Next one we have are paints and dyes. So global dyes and pigments market has witnessed remarkable growth. It's used in so many different industries such as textiles, constructions and plastics. And there's a lot of issues in sort of the manufacturing and the production of this. In the construction industry, paints and dyes play an important role in protecting building surfaces. And the key ingredients in these plastics, the paints and dyes includes chromium, lead and cadmium, which are often processed in countries with high risks of corruption and poverty, which contributes to forced labour risks and environmental degradation as well. So again, you can see how knowing, you buy paints and dyes, if you look at what's in a paint and dye, that's where you can start to dig deeper, whether there's forced labour risks in those supply chains. PVC is another one, again, very much similar to paints and dyes and the mining of minerals, but we're seeing this market really grow. It's forecasted the global market size of PVC will grow to nearly 60 million metric tons, and it's valued at something ridiculous like $68 billion, and it's expected to grow by 4% over the next couple of years. So the production of PVC involves hazards such as forced labour, health hazards and environmental risks. And the countries manufacturing PVC have documented links to forced labour again. What we're seeing in this space is very much workers trafficked again through state programmes where they're not able to refuse or leave the jobs that are assigned to them. So again, this is something that's very high risk product. Rubber, again, is another one. Rubber, interestingly though, has a couple of certifications associated with it. So you've got the Fairly Traded Natural Rubber, you've got FSC Rubber, and you've got PEFC certification for rubber growers. Similar to timber, it's very much linked to deforestation. And so we can see the links between the certifications here is where you would maybe look at deforestation, but they also include something around the labour that's involved there. So when they're going out to do assessments at the forest sites, they're not just looking at how they're managing the forests and how they're deforestising, they're also looking at the people who are operating on those sites as well. Stone is another one. So historically, stone is one of the first materials used in building construction, and it's been used for centuries and centuries. It's a very durable product, it's low carbon, it's fireproof. So there's lots of positives and benefits of using stone as a building material. However, because of the labour-intensive processes of cutting, sanding, polishing, that often involves forced and child labour in the production of stone. So forced and child labour remains an issue in stone quarries globally, particularly in countries such as China, Brazil, Angola, India, Vietnam, Turkey and Poland. And the ILO reports at least 500,000 workers in India are trapped in debt bondage, working in hazardous conditions in this space. So in Nepal, for example, entire families work along riverbanks to collect and break stones that are then transported to construction sites. And many children are involved in this work as well. So again, another sector that's high risk. You do as well have some relevant certifications here. So you've got the Natural Stone Institute Sustainability Standard, you've got Fairstone, and you've got a standard label as well. So you've got some certifications that can be looked at there to help that due diligence piece. Textiles is another one. Again, this is quite well known as in that area, high risk of modern slavery. But you've got natural fibres in your insulation, you've got it in your wall furnishings and upholstery. Cotton's really versatile, and it's increasingly being relied upon by architects and designers for sustainable building as well. However, there's high risks of labour exploitation, especially in that cotton value chain, from the picking and the processing to product manufacturing and then recycling. So we've seen, obviously, probably in terms of our garments that we're wearing, you can see them in the sweatshops that they're being manufactured, but it's going even further back to sort of that cotton picking and the processing piece. Then the final material to take a look at is timber. So illegal logging often takes place in remote locations around the world, in countries with little or no regulation. And again, it's very high with corruption. So again, looking at that interlinkage of corruption and modern slavery. So timber is the most utilised bio-based material in the built environment and one of the most widest used construction materials in the world. So 38% of wood products globally are being used for buildings and construction. Where we have issues around timber, it's looking at the embedded labour within that chain of custody of the material. So we have relevant certifications that look at this. You've got the American Tree Farm System, you've got FSC, you've got PEFC, and you've got Sustainable Forest Initiative as well. Forced labour is common in the timber industry and some major producers, primarily occurring in the logging and sawmills. Where we're seeing this, you're seeing violence, threats, non-payment of wages, and the confiscation of documents, and that's recorded in the logging industry. Those working in sawmills can often face excessive and unpaid overtime and may be forced to work in precarious conditions without PPE. There's poverty in many timber producing countries, which is a key risk factor driving communities to migrate for work in the forestry sector. Many are compelled to work without contracts to pay off recruitment fee debt. And you've also got Indigenous communities which are also being forced off their traditional lands and they're compelled to deforest them. So this is a really prevalent area where forced labour and modern slavery takes place. So we've showcased some of the high-risk materials there. But what's next? You're taking a look at where some of those issues might sit, but what is next? What is it that an organisation needs to do? So next steps when you're thinking about tackling the issues of modern slavery and forced labour in your supply chains is due diligence. So the key point around due diligence is that it's ongoing. It's how you bring all your processes around forced labour and modern slavery, like audits and policies, how you bring it all together. So thinking about what is your organisation currently doing continuously to identify, mitigate and account for adverse impacts. So here's the definition. It's due diligence is the ongoing risk management process to identify, prevent, mitigate and account for how adverse impacts are addressed. In a nutshell, the key phrase around due diligence is prevent it, find it and fix it. What due diligence is not is saying we do this so we have zero slaves here. And we're seeing organisations who do state this don't fully understand how prevalent it is. As we mentioned at the beginning, as we've mentioned relating to some of these materials, slavery is in most of the things that we buy. So we can't say as a way of doing due diligence that we do this so we know that there's nothing. The whole point of due diligence is that you're going out there and you're finding something, you're creating more awareness of it, and then you can fix it. How is it that we do that? So we often see, lots of organisations have great policies in place, but do those policies link through into the actual practice that they're doing in their operations and with their supply chain? So here are some of the key things that if an organisation starts putting things in place, they have a more robust due diligence process. And later in the year when that ISO standard is published, you will probably see some of these headings showing what that framework to assess and address forced labour and modern slavery risks in your operations and supply chains. These are the headings that it will likely follow. So starting right at the very top, you've got your leadership and commitment. So this is really important in setting the commitment right from the very top. So top management should make a commitment and integrate that management of risk into the activities and demonstrate leadership and commitment to these areas. Once you've got that commitment, you want to start assessing where your risks are and set some priorities. So risk identification helps to understand where your risks sit in your operations and your supply chains. It should identify where the situations that you're involved in modern slavery, whether it's in your own operations, whether it's in your business associates, whether it's in the supply chain. And it's a real essential step to ensure that transparency requirements are targeted and focused. So risk assessment helps to prioritise because, as we've mentioned, it's such a prevalent issue, you really can't and shouldn't deal with everything. So by doing a risk assessment, you can really figure out where are my pertinent risks that we need to focus our efforts on. Risks can be looked at in many ways, including those within your own organisation, within different tiers of your supply chain, both upstream and downstream, with your business associates, and by private individuals working on behalf of your business. So a typical way to assess risks is through a heat mapping process. So that assessment can be done at different levels. So it could be looking at your operations, so the different sites that you might have in your own operations, the different spend categories you have in your supply chain, the different suppliers you have in your supply chain. It could be done at lots of different levels. And when you're doing that assessment, you should be considering different risk factors. So consider whether the spend categories or the operations, does it involve vulnerable people? Is it sourced from a high-risk geography? And is it part of a high-risk business model or sector? Risk analysis should involve a detailed consideration of uncertainties, risk sources, business relationships, looking at the different consequences and likelihoods, and the effectiveness of the controls that you already have in place. We always recommend that when you do this risk assessment, that you do it in consultation with multiple stakeholders. So that helps to bring together different areas and expertise, taking into account different views and facilitating risk oversight and decision making, and also building a sense of inclusiveness and ownership of that risk. So if it's a risk within your supply chain, getting the people involved who actually are responsible for that relationship, get them involved so they understand. And then when it comes to that due diligence piece in the procurement process, they have more awareness of what those risks are. So it's a risk assessment and setting priorities is a crucial step for everything that comes next. Then we have training and awareness. So appropriate resources should be allocated to support the training needs of internal and external people. So thinking back to that risk assessment and setting priorities, mapping out who are the key people who need to be more involved in that, train them in a different way. If it comes to your supply chain, you've demonstrated who your high-risk suppliers, give them awareness training in a certain way. So tailoring the types of resources to the types of training that people need is really important. Recruitment and employee relations. So we very much look at the supply chain in this aspect. But obviously, your own organisation recruits people. So establishing responsible employment processes for people directly employed helps to mitigate that risk of modern slavery in its own operations. That responsible employment process should then be expected of contractors and subcontractors or agencies supplying labour. So it's filtering further and further through the supply chain as well. Then we have stakeholder engagement and communication. So similar to that training and awareness piece, it's really important to educate workers so that they know their rights. So it's important for them to be aware of what their rights are so that they're aware if they're actually being exploited themselves. For example, those who are most vulnerable and at risk of modern slavery, they need to know where to go for help. So to communicate to them, put posters in bathrooms or canteens, tailor the way that you're engaging them depending on what it is that they need to know. For those who are managing people, they need to know how to spot the signs of modern slavery, how to raise a concern, how to support, or where to go for additional support. Then when it comes to the supply chain, tailor the way that you communicate with them as well. Then we have that supply chain and procurement piece. So very much linked with assessing your risks and setting priorities into how you engage with suppliers and you go through that procurement process. So for example, if you've gone through that risk assessment piece and you've got a bunch of low risk suppliers, what you do with them is you put the issue on the radar. So for them, you would use general communication. You'd just use your supplier code of conduct. You'd use standard terms and conditions. When you've got your medium risk suppliers, that's where you'd include generic questions in supplier onboarding. You'd have generic tendering questions and have some standard contractual terms around their due diligence processes. So this is a prime spot for using certifications and standards that we reference throughout. If you've got high risk suppliers, this is where you'd want to go above and beyond. So this is where you'd be commissioning your own audits, where you'd do supply chain mapping, where you'd really engage your suppliers and deep dive into their processes to assess and manage modern slavery risks. So you can see how that risk assessment piece very much links into the due diligence that you do with your supply chain. Next one is grievance remediation. So having a process in place to report anything that you're finding and also remediate what it is that you are finding. So processes and actions that provide remedy to individuals or groups that have been harmed. So having those processes in place before you go out to find something is really important, because if you're doing due diligence well, it's highly likely that you will find something, and you kind of don't want to find something and be like, what do we do now? So mapping out a process of, if we are going to find something, what it is that we do is really, really important. And then a final one, when it comes to any process, is that measurement and reporting. So performance and evaluation helps to improve the quality and effectiveness of the actions that you're taking. Having some metrics in place to monitor can be really important, but also reporting and reviewing should be built into existing governance models. So, conducting internal audits on the actions that you're taking, having a committee in place which comes together and discusses challenges that you found or the progress that you've been making, building it into board meeting agendas as well. And then finally, potentially publishing it externally. So you're being transparent in what it is that you're finding, the actions that you're taking, so others can learn from what it is that you're doing as well. Okay, I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has any questions. I can't see any in the chat. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I'll just give folks a chance to type if you do have any questions. And just a reminder, if you do have any questions that pop into your head after this session, feel free to reach out, and I'll be sure that Anna gets your question and we can respond.
Definitely, yeah. My contact details are at the end here as well. So you'll have my contact details shared at the end of this session. So if anyone does have any thoughts at the end of this, feel free to reach out. Any questions, feel free to ask.
We covered everything.
No.
It sounds like everyone's satisfied.
All good. In the follow-up, we'll make sure that you get the link to the Design for Freedom Toolkit, Global Slavery Index, the UNICEF ILO child labour video, and our solar panel guidance as well.
That's right. And just on the note of Design for Freedom, the organization is actually having a summit at their Grace Farms location next week. If you are planning to attend, hope to see you there. I'll be there. Yeah, I would absolutely recommend checking out some of Grace Farms resources. They're really, really useful. Thanks, Elizabeth. That's such a nice comment. That's why we're sharing all the slides, so you don't have to write everything down. So if there are any other comments, again, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll leave the session open for a few more moments. But like I said, do reach out. One thing that I will bring up is we will be circulating a survey, a feedback survey after the session. Would really, really appreciate it if you just took a few moments, fill that out. It really does help us improve these sessions. We run many webinars throughout the year, both in the UK and in the US. So yeah, we would very much appreciate your feedback. And if there are no other comments, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I think we'll leave it there. So yeah, wanted to again thank you, Anna, for a wonderful presentation. Really great session. I hope that you all found it useful. I know that I did. And thank you to you all for your time this morning. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Have a great day.